Our scripture lesson this morning comes from the book of Judges. You'll find that in your pew Bible on page 220, starting with chapter 4, verses 1 through 10. Listen for the word of God. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. So the Lord sold them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron and had oppressed the Israelites cruelly 20 years. At that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. Sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinadab, from Kedesh and Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take position at Mount Tabor, bringing 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the Wadi Kishon, which his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand." Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." And she said, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kedesh. Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kedesh, and 10,000 warriors went up behind him, and Deborah went up with him. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Some trust in armor, some trust in horses, some trust in weapons and swords, but I trust in the Lord. Bear in mind what the choir just sang. Now, we're in a series called Heroes, and our hero for today is Deborah, and you read about Deborah in the book of Judges, specifically in Judges chapter 4 and Judges chapter 5. Did you know Judges 5, which is a poem about Deborah, may possibly be the oldest scriptural literature that we have? It may be that was written even sooner than other parts of Scripture were written down. Anyway, that's just a little fun fact, piece of trivia. But you read about Deborah in the book of Judges, and here's what the book of Judges is about. Judges is about a time when the people of Israel had moved into the promised land. They had settled in this promised land that God gave them. It was a land flowing with milk and honey. It was a great place, and they settled down in their tribes with their families, and they planted their land, and they raised their crops, and everything was just hunky-dory until for some reason the Israelites started worshiping false gods. I mean, they just kind of got sucked in by their neighbors, the Canaanites and Midianites, and they would worship Baal and they would worship Asherah. And then what happened is God did what God had said He would do, which is when they would start worshiping false gods, God would let them get overrun by their enemies. And so this would go on for a while, and the people of Israel would be, like, this is not fun. And so they would cry out to God, "God, we're so sorry, please forgive us, please save us." And so then God would raise up a leader to rescue them. And these leaders were called judges, not necessarily because they were judges like we know judges today, but the Hebrew word for judge also means leader. So God would raise up these leaders, and these leaders would, rescue the people of Israel, and they would go back to worshiping the one true God, and everything would be hunky-dory for a while, and then for some reason they would start worshiping the false gods, and the whole cycle would start over again. That's what the book of Judges is about. It's about these vicious cycles of apostasy, followed by rescue, followed by faithfulness, followed by apostasy. Well, Deborah, our hero for today, we read about her in the middle of one of these cycles. It was in the middle of one of these cycles that God raised up Deborah as the leader of Israel. And Deborah was the only judge who was actually a judge. I mean, Deborah actually sat under a palm tree, and people would come to her with their court cases, and she would listen to each side, and she would settle the dispute. You know, kind of like Judge Judy. Except Judge Deborah had an advantage over Judge Judy because Judge Deborah had a direct line to God. See, she was a prophet. She was someone who could hear the voice of God. Deborah could hear the voice of God. Well, one day Deborah was sitting under her palm tree and she was settling cases, and all of a sudden, almost out of the blue, Deborah said, "Go get Barak." Barak was the general of the Israelite army. She said to the people standing there, "Go get Barak." And you know, even though ancient Israel was a very traditional, patriarchal culture in which women were considered second-class citizens, despite that, nobody seemed to have a problem following orders from Deborah. So they went, and they got Barak. Barak came, and Barak stood before Deborah. And Deborah said, "Barak, God says it is time. Gather the Israelite army. Take position on Mount Tabor. For God says that God will deliver the Canaanites into your hand, and you will defeat Sisera." Now, Sisera was the commander of the Canaanite army, and his very name sounded evil. Sisera. Let me hear you say that. Sisera. Sounds like the hissing of 1,000 snakes. Evil. And he was evil. Sisera had 900 iron chariots. He had superior weaponry, superior technology, and for 20 years he had oppressed Israel with his military brutality and his cruelty. And he was just almost like evil incarnate. And when Barak heard the name Sisera, he started to shake in his boots. And he thought, "Oh, no, I'm not going up against Sisera." But he didn't want to say that out loud and sound like a chicken. So he just said to Deborah, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." And Deborah looked at Barak and she thought, "What is it with these men? They don't get it. They think it's all about them. They don't understand it's not about what they can do, it's about what God can do. It's not about what they can do, it's about what..." So Deborah looked at Barak and she says, okay, Barak, I'll go with you, but you need to understand something. You're going to win this battle, but you're not going to get credit for defeating Sisera, because God is going to deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. Well, Bart kind of hung his head in shame. He was a little bit embarrassed, but oh well. He went and he gathered the Israelite army, and then Deborah came and joined him, and together they went and they climbed Mount Tabor and they camped on top of Mount Tabor. And that night, Barak hunkered down in his tent, and he thought, okay, good, I'm safe up here because those 900 chariots are not going to come up a mountain. So as long as I stay up here, I'm good. But early the next morning, before it was even dawn, Barak awoke to the voice of Deborah saying, "Barak, get up. God says it's time." Slowly and reluctantly, Barak got up. Slowly and reluctantly, Barak gathered the Israelite army. He got them into their ranks, and slowly and reluctantly, they began to march down the slopes of Mount Tabor towards the plain of Megiddo. Now, as they got down the mountain just a little bit further, they looked out and they could see the Canaanite army gathered on the plain of Megiddo. They looked out. The plain of Megiddo is the floor of the valley of Jezreel. and it is the most fertile farmland in Israel even today. It's the breadbasket, and it's watered by the Kishon River, which flows right through the middle of the valley of Jezreel. And as the Israelites stood there on the slopes of Mount Tabor, and they looked out, and they saw 900 iron chariots gathered against them, and they looked at each other with fear in their eyes, and they said, "Are you kidding?" And Barak looked at Deborah and said, "Are you kidding?" But Deborah just pointed, and the Israelites kept marching. Now, when they got closer, they began to be able to see each individual chariot. And they realized that each one of those chariots was pulled by multiple horses, big, strong war horses. And each one of those chariots had armor plating around the sides, iron plating, to protect the 5 soldiers that were in each one of those chariots. And those soldiers were carrying heavy weaponry of all kinds. The weapons they weren't carrying, they had stashed in the pockets on the sides of the chariots. And the Israelites looked out at this, and they felt hopeless. They said, "There's no way. We will never, never conquer these enemies." Well, as they were standing there feeling hopeless, a new horror began. They saw the Canaanite archers pick up their long bows, notch their arrows, pull back on the long bowstrings. And then they saw the arrows begin to fly. And now the arrows were coming right for them. Now these Canaanite archers, they were good. They didn't usually miss. And as the Israelites watched the arrows coming for them, and the Israelites, they didn't have armor, they didn't have shields. The arrows were coming right for them. And in their hopelessness, they thought, what does it matter? What does it matter? Whichever of us doesn't get struck down by an arrow is just going to get chopped up by a sword or run over by a chariot. The arrows were getting closer and closer. And then, all of a sudden, it started to rain. The rain started coming down. I'm not talking about like drizzling or drops. I'm talking about buckets. I'm talking about torrential rain. It just started coming down in sheets. And the rain knocked the arrows out of the sky. The arrows hit the ground. And the rain just kept going, and the Kishon River flooded. It jumped its banks, and it flooded the Jezreel Valley. And the plain of Megiddo turned into mud, deep, thick mud. And those 900 chariots, those chariots of iron, that superior technology, those invincible chariots, got stuck in the mud. The Canaanite soldiers didn't know what to do. They were disoriented. This was not something they were accustomed to. The drivers of the chariots tried to turn the chariots around. They knew they couldn't make for the mountain. They were trying to go back, and so they were shouting, "Yah, yah, yah," flashing the reins, trying to get the horses to turn around, but the horses just slipped and fell. The chariots turned over. The soldiers, as soon as they hit the ground, their heavy armor and their weapons caused them to sink into the mud. They were completely disoriented. They tried to run away, but nobody knew which way to run. As they were running around in confusion, some of them got run over by chariots, and some of them, horses fell on them. Some of them drowned in the flood waters that were rising steadily. And the Israelites up on the slopes of Mount Tabor looked down, and they saw this. And all of a sudden, they had the advantage, because they didn't have heavy armor and heavy weapons. Light on their feet, they charged down the slopes of Mount Tabor. And they ran through the ranks of the Canaanite army and took them out. Well, meanwhile, Sisera, who was commanding the Canaanite army from the rear, when he saw all this happen, he did the noble thing. He did the honorable thing, the brave thing. He ran. He threw off his armor, he dropped his weapon, he jumped out of his chariot, and he took off, abandoned his men. And he ran as fast and as far as he could until the flood waters rose to the point and the mud thickened to the point that he could no longer run. He was just slogging his way and splashing through the water. And when he finally got to high ground, he no longer looked like the proud commander of a superior army. No, he looked like a pig, covered in mud from head to foot. Sisera got to the high ground and he started walking. And he saw a huge oak tree, and under the oak tree, a tent. And standing in the doorway of the tent, a mysterious woman. Now, he could tell from her dress that she was not a Canaanite. She was not one of his people. But he could tell she was not an Israelite either. He didn't know who she was. But boy, she knew exactly who Sisera was. The woman whose name was Jael, she watched Sisera coming towards her, and she knew who he was. Sisera, commander of the Canaanite army. Sisera, a terrorist. Sisera, a rapist. Sisera, a human trafficker. And as Jael watched Sisera coming towards her, she hatched a plan. As Sisera got closer to the tent, Jael said, come in, my lord. Don't be afraid." And of course, Sisera had no manners, because in those days it was against custom for a man to go into a woman's tent, but Sisera didn't care. He went into her tent, and he immediately collapsed on the floor. He said, "I'm thirsty. Bring me some water." And Jael said, "Oh, my lord, I'll do even better than that." And she opened a skin of milk, fresh, warm, delicious, whole milk, full of L-tryptophan, the chemical that makes you fall asleep. And she handed Sisera the skin of milk, and Sisera gulped it down, and then he wiped his mouth, and then he could feel the sleep beginning to overtake him. And he laid down on the floor. And then he remembered something. He said, "If anybody comes looking for me," because he knew Barak would be trying to find him to finish him off. He said, "If anybody comes looking, and stand in the door and tell them there's nobody in here." And with that, he rolled over on his side and he fell asleep. Quietly, carefully, Jael slipped out of the tent. She walked around the outside of the tent. She was looking at the wooden stakes that held the tent to the ground. She wanted to find the longest one. When she found it, she shook it loose. She pulled it up out of the ground. She was pleased when she saw how sharp it was. Quietly, carefully, she slipped back into the tent. She picked up the hammer that was lying by the door of the tent. Quietly, carefully, she knelt down beside Sisera. Quietly, carefully. She placed the stake on his temple. She raised her powerful right arm, which was strong from all those years of pounding in tent pegs. She took a breath. And bang, 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 3 steady strokes, and the wooden stake went through his head, through his skull, into the ground, and Sisera was dead. Mighty, powerful Sisera, arrogant Sisera, proud Sisera, evil Sisera, defeated by a simple tent-dwelling woman. Jael went and stood outside the tent, and sure enough, it wasn't long before Barak was coming, and he was looking for Sisera. And Jael said, "Would you like to see the man you're looking for?" And for the second time that day, Jael broke Middle Eastern custom and invited a man to come inside her tent. Barak walked in, and he looked, and there Sisera was, lying on the floor, covered with a blanket, with a tent peg through his head. Deborah's prophecy had come true. God had delivered Sisera into the hands of a woman. Now, what are we going to make of this story? I mean, this is a disturbing story. This is a violent story. But it's a story about fighting evil. In those days, fighting evil meant something different. I hope it means something different than what it means for us in the church today. I mean, I'm not encouraging any of you to go back to your garage and go through your camping equipment and pull out some tent pegs and no. But it's a story about fighting evil, and we are still fighting evil. The New Testament says, our struggle is not with flesh and blood, but with the dark powers of the universe, the forces of evil which wreak havoc among us. All of us are struggling. All of us are struggling with something. The problems in our world, the problems in our society, the problems in our own lives, and these are all the result of evil. We are fighting evil. And so these Old Testament stories, they can be for us symbolic of the fight against evil that we're still fighting today. So I invite you to think about those Canaanite soldiers and think about the Israelites standing there on Mount Tabor, and they're looking out at the Canaanite soldiers with their 900 iron chariots, and let the Canaanite soldiers symbolize your problems. Problems in the world, problems in our society, problems in your own life. Think about the Canaanite soldiers and let them be a symbol of that. And maybe you feel like those Israelite soldiers did. I know I do. You're looking out at all these problems and you're thinking, there's no way. You feel hopeless. But then think about this. Notice that Deborah was able to defeat the Canaanites with 3 secret weapons. 3 secret weapons that Deborah had. And if you're taking notes, you want to write these down. 3 secret weapons that Deborah had. Here's the first one. The voice of God. Deborah heard the voice of God. She had such a close relationship with God that she could hear God's voice. The voice of God. And here's the thing. Deborah knew what God wanted her to do. Deborah knew where God wanted her to go. Deborah knew she was able to discern the will of God. She knew when it was time to act, and she knew when it was time to wait. Now, here's the problem, my sisters and brothers. So many times, we see a problem or an issue, and we just go out and do something without ever stopping to consult God. We don't listen to God. We don't slow down and take the time to ask God what we ought to do. You say, but Claude, we want to go out and do good things. Well, guys, we don't want to just do good things. We want to do God things. But in order to do God things, we have to listen to the voice of God. That was Deborah's first secret weapon, the first of God, the voice of God. Her second secret weapon was the power of God. And by this I mean that rainstorm, that powerful rainstorm that came down and defeated the Canaanite army. It really was, the Israelites didn't defeat the Canaanites with their puny little weapons. It was that rainstorm, it was that flood. And that's something only God can do. That was the power of God, and it was something only God can do. And my friends, please hear me. This is what we need. We need the things that only God can do. You see, only God can change a heart. Only God can save people. Only God can heal people. Only God can transform people from the inside out. Only God can change hearts. And that's what we need. If we're going to face the problems of today, only God can change a heart. Government can't do it. Business can't do it. Education, as important as that is, can't do it. Only God can change a heart. We need the things that only God can do. We need the power of God. And there's only one way to get that. There's only one way to get the power of God. You unleash the power of God through prayer. prayer. Just the other day, I was with some pastors from Kernersville. This was the Kernersville Clergy Association and pastors of different denominations, and we were talking about the problems in our society and how those problems are coming into Kernersville. Did y'all know we have gangs in Kernersville? Did you know that? I had no idea. Gangs, like you see in New York and Los Angeles, they're coming to Kernersville. So we were talking about these problems, and I looked at a couple of the pastors in that meeting who are African American. Carol Fulton, whom a lot of you know, Keith Vereen, pastor of Providence Baptist over by Civitan Park. And I looked at Carol and Keith and I said, guys, please tell me, what can we really do about the racial tension in this country right now? And Carol and Keith looked at me and they said, Claude, there is only one answer: prayer. Only prayer can change people's hearts and solve these problems. And so, friends, we need the power of God. We need God to do things that only God can do. And that's only going to happen through prayer. So, Deborah's secret weapons. First, the voice of God. Second, the power of God. And then here's the third one: the mysterious ways of God. And by that, I'm referring to that mysterious woman named Jael, who seemed to come out of nowhere. I mean, she wasn't a Canaanite. She wasn't an Israelite. A total surprise, this woman was. The mysterious ways of God. Now, this is not in the Bible, but I can imagine that as Deborah stood there on Mount Carmel and Mount Tabor, and she watched the battle, and she saw Sisera slip off and run away, and she saw that he was going to get away, and maybe Deborah stood there and said, God, excuse me, you said you were going to deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. But it was clear Sisera was getting away. And so what Deborah had to do at that point was trust that God was going to take care of this in His own way. She had done her part, and now she had to trust God to do the rest. And guys, here's what you need to understand. Sometimes we just have to do our part and trust God to do the rest. We have to trust the mysterious ways of God. I think about the Christian missionaries who were forced out of China in 1949 when the communists took over, and Chairman Mao's wife swore that she was going to stamp out Christianity in China. So when these missionaries were forced out, they left behind just a small handful of Christians. And, they thought, man, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to the Christian church in China? And for years, China was a closed country, and there was no communication with the Christians in China. In fact, not even until the 70s were they able to check in on the church. Well, in the 70s, when China just cracked open a little bit and the missionaries went back, they were absolutely astounded to discover that in their absence, despite heavy persecution by the communist government, the Christian church had exploded. They had grown like fire, like wildfire. And today, despite the communist persecution, in China, there are an estimated 100 million Christians. There are more committed church-going Christians in China than in the United States. The mysterious ways of God. Sometimes we just have to do our part and then trust God to do the rest. So, Deborah's 3 secret weapons. Number 1, the voice of God. Listening to God, taking direction from God, acting when God says to act. Number 2, the power of God. Praying for God to do things that only God can do. And number 3, the mysterious ways of God. We do our part, and then we trust God to do the rest.